In a world plagued by generic noise, one goblin can save us all.
Hey gang, just to let you know, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com and originalmagicart.store. Using the code gets you 10% off orders $10 or more, and you get to help out the channel at the same time. Hey gang, and welcome back. Today's game takes place at Platinum Star Games, and I got to film a game with 4 brand new faces. First, we have Jack, who's one of the owners of the store, playing his Vaevictus deck, keeping Cinderglade, Wasteland, Forest, Palace Siege, Ashnod's Altar, and a Golgari Signet. Next up is Kyle playing Edgar Macabre and keeps a Bloodstained Mire, an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, Caves of Koilos, Coat of Arms, Gatekeeper of Malakir, and Tithe Drinker. Next up is Grant playing Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, keeping Teferi Mage of Zhalfir, an Island, Sensei's Divining Top, Mana Drain, Remand, and Snapcaster Mage. Last but not least, we have Tom playing his Gisa Geralf deck, and he keeps a Diregraph Colossus, a Dimir Signet, a Swamp, a Gravedigger, Altar of Dementia, Risen Executioner, and a Crypt of Agadim. We roll off, and Tom wins the die roll and starts us off. Tom plays a Crypt of Agadim, which comes into play tapped. Jack also plays a land that comes in tapped, Cinderglade, and he passes turn. Kyle plays a Bloodstained Mire, and he passes. Grant plays an island and casts Sensei's Divining Top. At the end of Grant's turn, Kyle cracks his Mire, taking 1 to go and find a Sacred Foundry. Tom plays a Swamp, and he casts a Dimir Signet. Jack plays a Forest and casts Golgari Signet, which prompts Tom to give him a high 5 for being Signet siblings. Kyle plays an Urborg, and he casts a Tithe Drinker. This triggers Edgar Markov's Eminence ability, and Kyle gains a 1/1 Vampire token before passing turn. Grant activates his top in his upkeep to look and rearrange the top 3 cards of his library. He draws for turn, playing a Hollowed Fountain untapped and taking 2. Grant then casts Preordain, scrying 2 cards and bottoming both before drawing. Tom plays his own Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth, and everyone's swamps become even more swampy. He then casts Gisa Geralf and mills himself for 4. Jack plays a Wasteland and casts an Ashnod's Altar, passing to Kyle. Kyle plays a Cave of Koilos as his land for turn, and he moves to combat. He swings the Tithe Drinker at Jack for 2, and the token at Grant for 1. This gains him 2 life as the Tithe Drinker connects, and Kyle then pays 3 in his second main phase to cast Captivating Vampire, gaining another Vampire token from the Eminence trigger. Grant casts a Soul Ring in his main phase, and with nothing else, passes. Tom plays a City of Brass as his land for turn, and we see a Jet Medallion hit the field. Tom then needs only pay 2 to cast his Diregraph Colossus, who gains 2 +1/+1 counters because of what's in Tom's graveyard. Tom then moves to combat, and he swings Gisa Geralf at Kyle for 4. After they connect, he passes through his second main phase and passes. Jack draws for turn, but has nothing to play and passes. Kyle plays a Battlefield Forge as his land for turn, and he moves to combat again. He swings a token and the Tithe Drinker at Tom for 5, the Captivating Vampire at Jack, and a token at Grant for 2 each. Tom blocks the Tithe Drinker with his Colossus, and in response, Kyle takes 1 from tapping his Battlefield Forge to cast Path to Exile, targeting the Colossus, paying 1 more to also pay for the Extort trigger, draining his opponents for 1 and gaining 3. Tom's zombie gets exiled, and he goes to find an island, and then the rest of the damage goes through. At the end of Kyle's turn, Grant activates his top, and then begins his own turn. Grant plays a Cavern of Souls in his main phase, presumably having just drawn it. He names humans, and then pays 4 to cast Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. And with nothing else, he passes to Tom. Tom plays a Mutavault, and he casts Corpse Connoisseur with Gisa Geralf's ability, thankfully not having to worry about the Grand Arbiter attacks because of his Jet Medallion. He goes to his library, and he grabs Sidisi, Undead Vizier, and puts her into his graveyard. Tom then moves to combat, and Gisa and her brother once again smash into Kyle for 4. Jack draws and plays a mountain, but unfortunately the Grand Arbiter tax is kind of messing with what he has in his hand, so he has no choice but to pass to Kyle. Kyle draws for his turn, and he plays a Sulphurous Springs, assembling his Exodia of Pain lands. He then pays 4 to cast a Gatekeeper of Malakir, paying for both the Kicker and the Arbiter tax. Before the spell can resolve though, Kyle gains another 1/1 Vampire token thanks to Edgar's Eminence trigger, and also pays the 1 white to extort the spell. I'm impressed with Kyle's ability to pay 5 mana for a 2 mana spell. Grant lets the spell resolve, and Kyle has the Kick Gatekeeper force Grant to sacrifice a creature. With the sacrifice trigger on the stack, Grant pays 1 blue to flash in Snapcaster Mage. He gives Preordained Flashback, and then lets the mage get sacrificed. Kyle then taps 5 vampires and steals Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, making him a vampire with the Captivating Vampire's ability. Kyle then moves to combat, and swings the Tithe Drinker at Grant for 3 and gains 3 when it connects. Grant uses his top on his upkeep, rearranging the top 3, and draws for turn. He then pays 2 to cast Path to Exile, exiling his own commander, and Kyle gets to go and find a basic. With nothing else, he passes to Tom. Tom plays an island for his land for turn, and in his first main phase, we see Tom cast Danse thanks to Gisa Geralf's ability. She hits the field, and Tom has her exploit trigger target herself, sacrificing herself and letting him go tutor for a card. Tom then casts a Death Baron, followed by an Altar of Dementia, and he moves to combat. This time, Gisa and Geralf aren't alone, and Tom swings them and the Corpse Connoisseur at Kyle for 8. Jack draws for turn, and without the Grand Arbiter on the field, is finally able to cast his Gilded Lotus in his main phase. He does so, and passes to Kyle. Kyle drops a swamp for his turn, which is a triple swamp at this point with all the Urborgs out. He then taps 2 mana to pay for Soul Ring and extort it thanks to the Tithe Drinker. Kyle isn't done extorting though, and he pays 6 this time to cast Coat of Arms and extorts that as well. Kyle then taps 5 vampires to try and steal Tom's Gisa Geralf, but with the steel trigger on the stack, Tom sacrifices his commander to the altar, milling himself. Moving to combat then, Kyle swings a Tithe Drinker at Tom, who is now an 8/7, and Tom takes 8 while Kyle gains 8 when they connect. At the end of turn, Grant once more activates his top to arrange the top 3. Grant follows in Jack's footsteps and casts his own copy of Gilded Lotus before passing to Tom. Tom activates his Crypt in his main phase and generates 5 black mana. He uses 3 of it to cast Liliana, Untouched by Death, and upticks her, milling the top 3 cards. Tom actually finds 2 zombies, which is enough for her trigger, and each of his opponents loses 2, and he gains 2 life. Tom then taps a land and uses his remaining floating mana to cast Risen Executioner. Tom then loses 1 from the City of Brass as he casts Gravedigger, who upon entering returns Sidisi to his hand. Jack casts some much needed graveyard hate in the form of Deathrite Shaman in his main phase, and follows up with a copy of the Gitrog monster. He then passes to Kyle. Kyle untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Graven Karen's and pays to cast and extort Edgar Markov. Grant responds to this by countering it with a mana drain, and before moving phases, he uses the 1 floating blue to use his Top's ability. Kyle begins to wonder who he should attack with all of his giant vampires, and Tom makes him a deal. He'll animate his Mutavault to pump Kyle's board even more if Kyle promises to attack and take out Grant. Kyle moves to combat and accepts Tom's deal, and he swings his 3 tokens at Grant and the rest at Liliana. Tom keeps his end of the bargain and animates his land, and Jack counts up the damage and seeing a chance to save Grant and to an extent also keep himself in the game by hoping Grant can deal with the vampire army, Jack sacrifices his wasteland to destroy the Mutavault. He draws a card as his wasteland dies, and Tom responds to this as well by sacrificing the Mutavault to the Altar of Dementia, milling himself for 15. We then move to combat damage, and Grant drops down to 1 and Liliana dies, and with nothing else, Kyle passes turn. Grant untaps and draws for turn, knowing fully well that a Terminus is sitting on top of his library. He pays the miracle cost of it, and all of a sudden Kyle's massive board isn't, well, there at all. Tom responds to the miracled sorcery by sacrificing his board to the Altar of Dementia, milling Grant for a bunch of cards. Grant then enters his main phase, gaining all that colorless mana from his mana drain that countered Edgar Markov, and he tops in his main phase. He does a top swap, and he plays an island for his turn. Grant then recasts Grand Arbiter Augustin IV, and he passes turn. Tom activates his Crypt of Agadim in his main phase and floats 12 black mana. He recasts Gisa Geralf, milling 4. Tom is then able to cast the Diregraph Captain with Gisa Geralf's ability from his graveyard that he recently milled, and he's surprised that Grant lets it resolve. Tom then moves to cast a Gravecrawler from his graveyard, and Grant counters it with Remand. Tom puts the zombie back to his hand and moves to recast it once Grant has drawn a card. With the spell in the stack, Grant has another response though and flashes into Fairy. This doesn't really stop anything, as Tom sacrifices the now resolved Gravecrawler to the altar and uses the on-death trigger from the captain to kill Grant. Tom is then able to cast a Rooftop Storm unimpeded, which is enough proof that he can kill the table through a combo and the rest of the guys scoop it up. Game review time. So unfortunately Jack really wasn't able to do very much of anything. The Grand Arbiter tax kept him off of casting Gilded Lotus, which kept him a few turns behind, plus he missed a few land drops. All in all, unfortunately it wasn't a great game for him. On the other hand, Kyle had a great game going until the end. He was fully aware that Tom and Grant were his two main opponents, with Grant being too control-y and basically being able to lock him out of the game if it got to it, and with Tom being a combo-based deck and basically being able to combo off on his turn as opposed through a combat step. He was a bit disappointed afterwards and realized he should have attacked with everything at Grant as opposed to sending some at Liliana, since she wasn't really doing very much or bringing that much to Tom. I think Grant kept a super risky hand early on, but I know he didn't want a mulligan. He was able to hang in there for quite a bit, but unfortunately when you're facing against a super aggressive deck across from you and a super combo deck next to you, you always want to have tons of mana to be able to deal with either of them at any time. But that doesn't leave you with much to forward your own board state. I think Tom did a great job of using politics to help him win the game. He did a great job of convincing Kyle that Grant was more likely to board wipe him and cause him to lose any kind of board position he had, while at the same time he would clear out his own problems with Grant being the only person who could counter his spells like Rooftop Storm. I liked the interaction with Mutavault and Coat of Arms essentially pumping up all of Kyle's creatures, so that was kinda cool, and it was even better when Jack basically denied him it and kept Grant around.